So the year was 2019. I was about 2 years into my calling into ministry, maybe a little more, 3 or 4 years maybe. And I was a worship pastor of a small church plant in the inner city in KCMO, and things were good. My family and I were chugging along. If any of you are familiar with church planting, you know it's kind of a crazy time, and that was no exception for us. We were in a crazy, crazy time. Because it was a church plant, there wasn't a whole lot of money going around for the limited staff that we had, so I had taken on a second job. And through the grace of God and the generosity of some other people, I picked up this part-time job delivering really fancy, heavy furniture to the lovely, wealthy folks of the Midwest region. And these mornings were awesome. I actually got to work with a lot of the guys that I was on staff with or who are our residents or interns at the church. And so it was really good. I was working with friends, but the downside was it was a lot of like 3 and 4 o'clock mornings, really, really early days, and drives to Omaha, Nebraska, Des Moines, Iowa, down to Wichita, just all these different kinds of places. And during that time, while I was on the truck, I was often talking to volunteers, structuring things for the service coming up that week. I was kind of working both jobs at the same time, and this went on for a little while, and I was digging what was going on. And then one of the 3 or 4 o'clock mornings that I had to wake up, I noticed something kind of peculiar in my body. I noticed that when I woke up, my chest was a little tight. I had the sensation of my limbs kind of shaking and tingling, and it was really strange. And I just kind of wrote it off as maybe I was tired that day, got in the truck and went on my way to work. And then pretty soon after a little while of that kind of reoccurring, I started to have that experience when I went to bed. I started to shake a little bit or just have racing thoughts, or it was hard to get to sleep, and I didn't really understand what was going on. And pretty soon I started to notice a correlation between the pressures of a church plan and a second job and trying to figure out money for my family, and all of these things start to mount. The pressure was kind of building in me until one day I got home from work kind of earlier in the afternoon, because if you get up at 3 a.m. for work, guess what? You get to get off a little early in the afternoon. And I got home and sat down on the couch. My wife and my daughter, we just had one kid at the time, were out with our only car. They were out shopping or doing something, and I started to get a little antsy, and that feeling started to return back to my body. And I was like, okay, I'll watch a movie. I'll rest. I'll take a nap. But I wasn't able to rest. I wasn't able to take a nap. I wasn't able to focus on whatever movie was on. I think it was Twilight. Don't judge me. And pretty soon, I couldn't even sit down. I felt kind of stuck and trapped in this place. And so here I am, pacing the living room of our small apartment in Lenexa at the time, and then my heart rate starts beating faster and faster in my face. I can feel the heat and blood rushing to my face, and I'm sweating a little bit and starting to tremble. And this was the first panic or anxiety attack that I had ever had. The experience would happen for some time until it would grow so big that I couldn't even leave my house, or I couldn't go 10 minutes from my house, or I couldn't get stuck in traffic. My world felt so small. And the pressures and stresses and fears and worries of my life were just mounting to this place that I couldn't get out of my own head. I couldn't see any further than the end of my nose, and I felt stuck, and I felt trapped. And I'm wondering if this is landing with anybody in the room right now. Amen. We know that feeling, right? We know the feeling of the worries and the fears and doubts of our life creeping up on us from somewhere until they become more than just a nagging thought in the back of your mind, and they begin to manifest physically. And this is what was happening in me, and I wasn't able to identify it at first, and pretty soon it was just all-encompassing. If you guys joined us last week, we were in the middle of the story of Gideon, and we're going to continue in the story of Gideon this morning, and you're going to see how this theme, this thread of fear, just like this innate sense of fear and hiding and control, permeates the entire narrative of this story. If you remember a couple weeks ago, Pastor Mark was walking us through the time when Gideon was so paralyzed by fear of the impending threat and the occupation of a Midianite army, he finds himself hiding away in a wine press in a hole in the ground, just to thresh the wheat and harvest enough wheat for himself and for those around him. And then you remember last week we were exploring Gideon kind of coming out of his shell a little bit. And we find him dismantling and breaking down the altar to Baal that had been set up, the god of the Midianites, and the Asherah pole that were there. And pretty soon the other people wanting Gideon's head on a stick, right? Because he was dishonoring their altar and their God. And ultimately it led to Gideon seeking reassurance from the Lord of what he was doing, of this sense of a call he had for God to make him a leader of the tribe of Israel to overcome the Midianites. And I've actually broken up this chapter. So today we'll be in chapter 7. It's more of Gideon. And I've actually broken up this chapter into 3 movements or 3 parts. You can think of it as 3 parts. And we're going to begin with part 1 today. I call part 1 the fear. We find Gideon in the 7th chapter of Judges convinced that he is to deliver Israel from the hand of the Midianites. And he assembles the army of Israel that's at his disposal. It's roughly 32,000 men. Now, keep in mind, that sounds like a very impressive army, but we know, and he knows at the time, that this Midianite army was upwards of around 150,000 at the time. So here's what it says in chapter 7, verse 1. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Ehud. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into your hands, or Israel would boast against me. They would say, 'My own strength has saved me.' Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. Just to give you guys a sense of what that setting may have looked like, of them being camped at Mount Gilead and next to the spring of Ehud, we actually have a picture. I don't think that bar was there at the time. And erosion may have happened a little bit in the last 3,000 years, but in general, this is kind of where they're camped out, is near this spring. Here's another really interesting part about this location, that God had led the Israelites in preparation for this battle against the Midianites, is it overlooks the camp of the Midianites. If you can imagine, they're not just sort of like hidden away, not totally kind of sure where the Midianites are. They're actively overlooking this impressive army of already a violent oppressor and occupier of this space. An army roughly around the size of 150,000 with their measly 10,000 men. And they've got to be a little afraid. Kind of has the echoes of some of the other stories we know from the Bible. The story of Jericho, taking the few and bringing about an unconventional victory through unconventional means and methodology. So we're familiar with the strangeness of God's tactics, but I don't think that actually lessens Gideon's sense of the gravity of the situation. Here's where it gets a little more strange. Verses 4 through 6. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs, while the rest got down on their knees. If you're like me, you probably get a little hung up on the details of why God chose this way to whittle down the army. There's a lot of different thoughts on how this happened. We're not going to get into those today, but here's the basis of what we know, is that God is still trimming down the army. Why? We go back. Because if the army's too big, you're going to think it was all done in your strength. So here now we have just under 10,000. We have 300 shaved off, except the 300 is who God chooses to fight the battle. And in this moment, it's almost as if God is deliberately bringing Gideon and his army directly into the most uncomfortable, the most fearful, the most insecure place, right up against an already impressive and fear-inducing enemy, and then bringing them even further to whittle down these numbers to next to nothing. I mean, he's bringing them into the territory of insane fear and unlikeliness of victory. And I think that there's a reason why God does this. I don't think that this is an accident. And I think this is something that God does with all of us as a father. He brings us right up to the threshold, right next to the thing that we fear the most, that we worry about the most. He brings us right up to it. And this action that God is performing, not just with Gideon, but with all of us, I think it's better that we see this as a blessing and not a curse. This is an opportunity for us to actually examine what it is that makes us the most afraid. And this is what God does with Gideon. He allows Gideon to name his fear, to confront his fear. This brings us into part 2. We call part 2 the friend. So after almost a year of this debilitating anxiety and this worry that had made my life so small, God seemed to offer kind of this reprieve. I took a different job, and we had a free place to live at the time, and things were getting comfortable. We were doing pretty good, and not just because of the external circumstances, but because I began to experience and explore something called spiritual formation. It's a word or an idea, a principle that you'll probably hear us talk a lot here at Vineyard about. Spiritual formation is the way that God forms us and matures us, and he does it through sometimes a grinding or an uncomfortable scenario in order to bring us into further maturity, right? And he does this all kinds of different ways. And this is kind of what I was experiencing. My life was slowing down. I was taking time to be with God in my mornings and middle of the day and at night. And I started to have a sense of peace. But how many of you guys know, if you ever take time to sit in the quiet, there's those days when you're sitting still and you're sitting quiet and you just still hear and feel this little undercurrent of anxiety. The stress and the tension that you're carrying in the day-to-day life still is sort of there just bubbling underneath the surface. But as I was going through this, it wasn't like a restlessness of anxiety. I began to identify a different kind of restlessness. It was this restlessness that, man, okay, everything feels like I've got it managed, but it doesn't feel like this is the end-all, be-all goal that God is leading me into, is to just manage this sense of uncomfortability in my life. And pretty soon I felt this tug on my heart for adventure. I felt this tug on my heart to explore the unknown, and not just geographically, not just places, but really travel into the uncomfortable circumstances of my own heart. And he did this by reminding me one day as I was journaling of just these joyful moments I had as a kid of going with my grandpa out fishing and hunting and camping and all of these amazing adventures that I had. And I just began to come alive again at the thought of doing those things, except I didn't just jump right into those things. What did I do? I did what a lot of us maybe sometimes tend to do, and I settled for reading about those things. I settled for binge watching others doing those things. In fact, I became a really big fan of the Narnia books. I became a really big fan of a show called Meat Eater. Anybody watch Meat Eater? Yeah, it's usually grunts from a handful of guys. That's kind of how it was last time too. Oh yeah, I love it. And that was kind of where I sat for a little while. I was okay with just kind of like dipping a toe into the idea of becoming adventurous and stepping out of my comfort zone. And I was having lunch one day with a friend, John. He's kind of a mentor of mine and a really awesome dude. And I'm walking him through the last 2 years. I realized I haven't talked to my friend John about where I've been the last 2 years. And then I get into the reminiscing and the happy, joyful memories I have of adventuring as a kid and hunting and fishing and my new obsession with Meat Eater. And John's eyes kind of get wide for a second, and he's like, man, I've been binging Meat Eater too. That's such a good show. In fact, I've never been hunting before. I've never even shot a gun, but I bought a gun last week. I want to go. I want to do this thing. And I was like, well, dude, let's go. And so pretty soon we hammer out the logistics of this thing. And I talked to another friend who gives us a day on some land to do a little bit of deer hunting. So here's where John and I are. As we find ourselves tucked away on a tree line on the edge of a plowed up, freshly plowed cornfield. And we're waiting and waiting and waiting. And pretty soon John says the words that if there's anybody in here who's ever been hunting in any fashion, specifically deer hunting, John says the words that cause your heart to just like leap and explode out of your mouth. And he goes, deer, 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 deer. And I look through the binoculars and I see about 200 yards away these two deer in this field. Here's what you should know is that while, yes, this was sort of a reliving a boyhood joy of mine, I've never actually shot anything before at this point. And John and I figure out as we're scoping out these deer 200 yards off that there's this little rise in the field, so we can't actually, when we try to position ourselves with our rifles, we can't actually get a good shot on these deer. So we decide we're going to do this super cool like commando thing and belly crawl like 50 yards out to the top of this little rise so that we can get a better vantage point. And so we're there and we feel so cool and we're dirty and there's like rocks and try not to break your gun as you're belly crawling. And I'm having the time of my life right now. And I look over and I swear, as I look to my left, John's on my right, I look to my left and I swear for a second I can see Jesus. And it becomes one of these holy moments that just stick with you for a long time. And it was like, in my mind and almost physically, I could see Jesus belly crawling through this field with us. And he's got this smile on his face as his eyes are lit up and they're wild and they're joyful. And it becomes this amazing moment where I realize I'm not just stepping out on my own with a buddy having this time. God is actually here with me. He's doing this thing with me. Like there is something important about this moment besides just the thrill of adventure that God wants me to key in on. And it's that he's with me, leading me into this thing. Because here's what I know. And I believe that this is core to every single person, regardless of your interests, regardless of your background. And I believe this is something God has instilled in the heart of every single person. And that is that there is a desire, a core desire in the heart of every human being for adventure. There's a desire in the heart of every single human being for adventure. So here we find Gideon, leading a presumably courageous but few soldiers, shaking in his boots at night. I wonder if he had that heaviness on his chest when he tried to go to bed. I wonder if he felt his limbs go numb at times. I wonder if he had sweat dripping down his forehead and in the palms of his hands whenever he was in meetings trying to create a tactical solution for this problem of the Midianite army. And this is what God says to him next. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I'm going to give it to you into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah." And just so I don't have to say this word alone, everyone in here needs to just say Purah. Can we just get it out? Purah. There we go. Thank you. Now you all have tasted the awkwardness of that name. Go down with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So he and Purah and his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. So let's review. We've got 32,000 men and an army that Gideon has assembled in order to take on a staggeringly large 150,000 man army in the Midianites. Then God whittles them down to 10,000. Instead of shaving off 300 from that 10,000, he shaves off 9,700 and we're down to 300 men. And has set an already fearful and a little bit flip-floppy man over a meager army and now is calling Gideon into the enemy camp. But listen to the consolation that God offers Gideon in the midst of this. He does say, get up, go attack the camp. But if you are afraid, take your friend, your servant Purah. In verse 10, this little factoid tucked away in the midst of that charge that God gives Gideon. He says, if you are afraid, take your friend with you. Because this is what I do know, and this is what I think is universally true whenever we're confronting fearful, insurmountable things and fears and worries in our life, is that God will always provide a friend. God will always provide a friend. He will always provide community for the one who's venturing off into the unknown and the fearful and uncomfortable. So who is your Purah? Who's your friend? Who's your ally that you will link arms with in the times when life gets the hardest? When you feel a tug on your heart from the Lord leading you into the unknown? leading you into the uncomfortable and fearful places. And hear this. At this point, if you could take one or two things away, this is one of the key things I want you to take away this morning, that community in our lives, the friendship of another, is essential to the human experience in the life in God. Yes, God is your friend. Yes, Jesus is with you, but the friendship of another, a companion, an ally, a community of allies is essential. They're essential for venturing into the frontier of our hearts, of our lives. And this is part 3. This is movement 3 of the Gideon story here in chapter 7, is the frontier. God has led Gideon to confront his fear, to name his fear, to acknowledge it. God has established a friend, an ally with him to go. And now it's time to venture into the frontier. And there's a phrase during this time of anxiety or exploration of adventure. My heart was coming alive. There's this phrase that I kept hearing over and over and over again in random places, and it was this: free people, free people. And I thought, yeah, that's a nice little bumper sticker. That could go on the back of my car. You know, it's like it didn't register, but I kept hearing it. I was like, oh yeah, cool. And you could do that with it, like hungry people. No, I don't know. And I just remember encountering this phrase. And one night I was in a prayer room at the church we were at, and I was worship leading a prayer set, and we were in a time of just listening to God. And this is what I heard God say. He brings this phrase, free people, back into my mind. And he says that I am leading you into freedom, and you will lead others into freedom. See, the victories of your life, of my life, are not just for ourselves. They're not just so that we come more alive, that we experience freedom, but he places a mantle on the one that has been set free. He places a duty and a charge on the one that he has set free in order to lead others into freedom. Those victories that God is bringing about in your life, that he is promising in your life, are for the sake of others. So God dealt personally with Gideon. He dealt with him directly in his unique fear. He based his approach on Gideon's character, on Gideon's story, on his personality. And he didn't do it in spite of fear. He did it by leveraging the fear, by using the fear that was pressing on the life of Gideon in order to walk him into victorious moments that we haven't even arrived yet, but we know that it's been promised. And I think that, again, this is God's process with us. If you could name that fear, if you could name that thing that is the most pressing on your life, that causes you the most unrest, I would pay attention to this, because he is highlighting for you the frontier that he's setting before you. And thanks to this process that God has employed with Gideon, he has a friend, and he's ready to make his move into the enemy camp and deliver a death blow to the Midianites. This is what it says in verse 17. Watch me, Gideon says to his men. Watch me. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow their trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout. Gideon's become a leader. He's become one who has snuck into the enemy camp with his friend. He's heard that the camp is actually fearful of the Israelites, that one man in the Midianite army had a dream that this crushing blow from the army of Gideon was coming, and he comes back a new man. He's walked so close into enemy territory, into the fear that's positioned just on the next hill of their encampment. And he's come back a leader. Watch me. Follow my lead. Gideon comes back a sort of, if we're going to stick with the sort of hunting trope or hunting theme that's kind of running through this message, Gideon comes back a sort of hunting guide. If you guys are familiar with a hunting guide or a fishing guide, there's someone who's become so well acquainted with the challenges, with the terrain, with the end goal, right? They know the back country, they know the paths and the non-paths, and they know what to do and what not to do. And Gideon has come back a sort of guide to his people. Gideon has been made into this by God. One who's drawn close to fear, but seen the promise of victory, and is now a guide to those who must take the same journey. And notice here in these couple of verses that there's no mention of a sword. God is already so unconventionally positioning an army to overthrow this oppressive enemy. He's not only doing it by whittling down an army to unconventional numbers, he's doing it through unconventional means. There's no sword here. There's no slashing, there's no clanging. This is what the victory of Gideon and his army looks like over the Midianites. Verse 19, Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guards. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. They're causing a commotion here. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth-shittah, towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel-meholah, near Tabbath. Notice the phlegmy H in there. I've been working on that for you guys. Meholah. There's not a single strike or slash of an Israelite sword. There's not even a movement inward towards the camp. There's only a commotion that plays on and leverages the fear of an already uncertain Midianite army that it's been promised that they will fall to the hands of Gideon and his 300. And we're reminded of God's reasoning in all of this, all of these unconventional methods and tactics. We're reminded why this is even the way it plays out. Remember, back in verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into your hands. Or Israel would boast against me, saying, my own strength has saved me." See, fear is a really powerful thing. Fear is how God actually brings Gideon into courage. Fear is how the Midianite army is destroyed. If you pay attention to the tactics of salesmen, if you pay attention to the media today, if you even just pay attention to your own heart in really stressful times, you'll notice that fear is an incredible motivator and catalyst. But it usually turns us in on ourselves and turns us against one another out of self-preservation. And this is what happens with the Midianite army. Fear turns the Midianite army in on itself, and it's what ultimately destroys them. This is all that's asked of God. This is all, or asked of Gideon. It's all that's asked of you by God. Courage. A step. What does courage look like? It looks like a step into the frontier. It looks like a step into the unknown. The willingness to take that one step and the increments to follow of a step-by-step approach to confronting our fears, to confronting that which worries us the most, is how victory comes. See, in the same way that core to every human heart is the desire for adventure, similarly to that, I believe core to the human heart is the need for a frontier. It's the need for the unexplored places. It's the need for the adventure, the movement into the unknown. And if you were to ask yourself, if you were to take a moment and reflect on this, what is your frontier? What is the frontier in your life right now? What's the step you feel afraid to take? What's God inviting you into? What's the step he's asking you to take into the unknown? And it might be, for a lot of us, for most of us probably, similarly to me, it might be our own story. Actually coming up against, but putting ourselves directly next to the parts of our story that have caused us the most pain. Maybe it's not quite as heart level as that. Maybe it's finances. Maybe it's our physical health. Someone said to me after the first service, "That's a really good message. At this point in my life, I don't really have anything that I'm particularly afraid of. I've gotten pretty," and these are their words, not mine, "I've gotten pretty old. I don't have a whole lot of fear around these things except for the fear of getting older and coming to the end of my life." And maybe it is for some of us. Maybe it is the 14er that we have yet to conquer and hike in the Rocky Mountains. Or maybe it's finally risking vulnerability in a community. Maybe it's finally risking vulnerability in a community. Because that would ask quite a bit of us. For some of us, community is not a good word. For some of us, friendship is not a good word, or family is not a good word. But in that community is where you find your purah. It's where you find your ally. It's where you find your friend. If you're curious about how to get into a community, if this community piece is sticking out to you particularly, I'd like to offer this up to you. Mark mentioned it before the service. We have Vineyard in 5. We have small groups that are launching, that we have ways to get you into a community where you can link arms with the people around you, where you can find your person. This is how you identify your purah, by the way. Answer the question, who has the keys to your house? I don't mean literally. I don't think anybody has the keys to my house, except, I don't even have a key to my house. My wife has the key to my house. Who has the keys to your house? Who has the kind of visibility into your life where they know everything about you, that you can call and explain your deepest fear? Who knows your frontier? That's who we need. I want to charge you with something today. As we're coming to a close, I want to offer a challenge to you. That if you do not know the messiness, but the insane joy of deep community with someone else, if you do not have the friend, the ally, would you consider reaching out to them today? Would you consider exposing the deepest parts of your heart to that person, letting them know where you are, letting them know where you think God is leading you? And I realize that this is scary for many of us, but I guarantee you, as you come closer and closer and closer to another human being, you'll find that similarly you become closer and closer and closer to a kind of freedom and a victory in your life. You'll begin to know a freedom that pulls your heart out of hiding and into adventure and into frontier and into the leadership of others to do the same. Would you pray with me?